if you'll permit me, Zane, I wanted, by way of introduction, to tell a little story about our graduate school days together.
Mhm.
And I think it'll segue nicely into some of the conversations that we have
Well,
coming up. Uh, there was a bar on the outskirts of campus that all of us grad students went to. It was the only bar that was really avoided by the undergrad. So a lot of grad students kind of made it their local spot, but it was a real hole. It was a dive. Um, and it was in front physically of a strip mall that closed fairly early in the day. And the strip mall started enforcing parking in the back where a lot of the people that were visiting the bar would park. Zane didn't know this at one point, got his car towed. It had happened to me a couple of days earlier. So out of sympathy, I guess I offered to drive him to pick up his car from the tow place. And it was one of those, you know, predatory tow companies. I don't think he'd been parked there for 15 minutes before they hauled his car away. And it was, of course, cash only, and you know, your fee accrues by the day. So I take him there, and he's outraged at the man's trying to charge him for like a full day's keeping of his car when it's been there for less than 15 minutes. And so Zane's in the office. He's threatening collective action. He's saying, I can get on the phone right now and have 50 people sitting in your office tomorrow. uh, he's threatening a sit-in. And I don't think I've ever seen a man so scared. I don't think I've ever seen the operator of a tow truck place just let somebody go without paying, which this man did. I think he was just terrified. So I think this illustrates a couple of things about Zane. I think it illustrates the fact that no injustice is too small to be protested. It indicates that every act is a political act to some degree, I think. And so much of those two ideas are present in your stories, and especially in this book. Stories of political upheaval, of violence, but always sort of in the background.
Right.
And so I wondered if we might not start off talking about the background, these kind of peripheral ideas of, there's always a war happening somewhere off in the distance. And I wondered if you might speak to that a little bit, how you've situated these stories in such a way that the violence is almost the landscape for the book.
Yeah. Thank you, Glenn. Yes, that's something that has come up almost at every stop in the book tour about you put it well in the sense that the war is almost like in the background, in the landscape. And the thing about it is that I wasn't thinking about what's interesting, and you're very familiar with the process of creation. I wasn't really thinking about the war, writing about the war. So one story, the opening story, I was thinking about the story that, as you know, stories come up and they stick with you, maybe a scene, and it stays with you for years, and then you have to write it. And what stuck with me is the story about a woman who was based basically on my own aunt, that was, ran out of cigarettes in the 2006 war on Lebanon, and decided to take take all measures to try to get her cigarettes, and that's what I was thinking about. But I wasn't really thinking about that's the first thought. I thought it was I thought it was a delightful thing to think about, and I thought maybe that I can relay that delight to the reader with this background. And of course, the war was in the background. There's when there's other stories in there. For example, that where with the titular story, Is This How You Eat a Watermelon, which is really about a man eating and drinking himself to death in Beirut. That again, what the idea was, I was sitting at a funeral, and somebody told me, I really didn't know the person that had passed away, but I was there with relatives, and they told me that this man has, sort of defied all of the advice he has been given in terms of taking care of himself. He had diabetes, he had high blood pressure, he had all these issues, and he basically ate and drank himself to death. And for those of you who are not familiar with the city of Beirut, it's a party town. We tend to see the war side of it, but it's a party town. You could easily eat and drink yourself to death in that city. But he as I wrote this story, he became a stand-in for the city itself. But also the war kind of rears its ugly head at towards the end, because he is so involved in his life that he has missed major events, and that could happen when you're in a war-torn country where you've experienced civil wars and other things. You become jaded, and if your life is comfortable, he was somebody that was comfortable financially, you can really avoid that. And the other story that really where war appears, it actually takes place on the Eastern Shore, and that's it's called killdeer. It's named after a bird that basically fakes its injuries to detract prey, predators from destroying its nest, because for some reason, it lays its eggs on the ground instead of the tree. So it says, through this evolutionary step, it developed this act where it pretends to be injured, and to detract the predators from her nest. But this is really a story about a poet that has serving a residency in the Eastern Shore of Maryland here, which for those of you not familiar with that area, it's a beautiful area where you go crabbing and fishing, and just really lovely waterways there. And he's serving a residency, and he starts to struggle with something that he's been basically holding back, and he starts to deal with the trauma. And the killdeer sort of acts as a kind of an alarm that keeps on waking him up to try, forcing him to face his trauma, so to speak. But the elevator pitch for that story would be like that. It's a poet that labors with trauma and gives birth to a poem at the end of the story. So that's how war fits into those stories.
Yeah, and I think trauma is an important factor there. The killdeer itself almost becomes this metaphor for post-trauma or post-traumatic, events, and it's this trigger for the character in the story and acts as a way to get back into his writing and access that experience that he had previously been unable to write about, and so becomes kind of a creative act as well. And I think I noticed that sort of theme of coping with trauma tends to crop up throughout the book. Just the ways, because again, as I mentioned before, the war and the political violence is always kind of a backdrop in these stories, but at the center is always the character. You evoke such beautiful characters in all of these stories, such fully realized ones, and and the way, and so the interaction there between the characters and the trauma is oftentimes takes the form of these kind of coping mechanisms, or you know, in the sense of the killdeer, it's the bird itself, um, but the characters are really the heart of this collection, I think. And um, in particular, my personal favorite comes from the first story, and I wonder if maybe we could transition into a reading
Mhm.
um, from Sharif versus the Party of God. This woman who you say is based on an aunt of yours. I think certainly for me, but I feel like many people have a relative, a grandmother, a great aunt, a cousin, somebody that they can relate this woman to. And so why don't you give us a little reading?
Sure, absolutely. And you're right, Glenn. At every stop in terms of this book tour, we've had somebody say, I know somebody, I know an aunt or a grandmother. Even you last night told me that you know an aunt that was like that. And so just to, this is the opening story. There's 7 stories in this collection. And this is the opening story. A couple of things I'm going to read actually the last couple of pages in the story. But what I want you to, just some background on this. This is I refer here to the summer rain, and it was the name of an operation of when there was in 2006 there was an Israeli invasion of South Lebanon, and that operation was called the Summer Rain. And the idea was that Lebanon actually doesn't have rain in the summer. It's one of those countries where it has 60 days of rain in the winter and then has like 300 days of sunshine. So the idea of the summer rain, meaning that they were going to rain bombs, carpet bomb basically South Lebanon. So that's the summer rain. And the other thing, what else I should tell you about this? So this late what in the first part of the story, this is a woman that's 70 years old, been smoking chain smoking cigarettes, and had just basically intercepted a platoon to try to get them to get her cigarettes, and she basically detains them for way too long and exposes them and herself to danger just to get the cigarettes, and she finally gets it. And here, what the part I'm going to read is at the end of the summer rain, at the end of the operation, when people are returning home, and where there was an incident of where there was a tank that was blown from the neighbor's house into this woman's courtyard, Sharif's courtyard.
A water tank, yeah.
So yeah, a water tank. Yeah, that's right. Not a tank. That's right. Uh, so uh, when summer rain ended, the landscape was littered with hundreds of bombed out homes and villages. Every single bridge along the coastal road to Beirut was destroyed. Farmland was scattered with cluster bombs. All the families returned south to settle back in the villages. The first weekend after the end of the war, there was bumper to bumper traffic on the few intact roads heading back from the cities and northern mountains to the rural south. Some already knew that their homes were hit, and yet they returned with mattresses strapped atop their cars because they still want to spend their weekend in the country like they did before, even if it meant sleeping on the floors of the skeletal remains of their ancestral homes. Sharifi's relatives were safe with the knowledge that she had survived the assault because they had contacted the Red Cross and were assured that although the balcony of the house was hit in the last days of the war, Sharifi was alive and kicking. The man sent by the Red Cross knew the village well. He was dispatched with another man to check on her. The two entered the courtyard from the valley side and found the dented and burned water tank in the middle of it and called out for Sharifi. She had been praying in her room, which seemed intact except for the curtains, which were shredded by fire, singed strips waving in the breeze. Sharifi emerged cocooned in her prayer white wrap, bundling her tightly wound scarf on her head, sealing all her graying hair from view. Without a greeting, she launched into a long lecture about knocking and announcing oneself before entering. The startled volunteers realized that they would have to let her finish and return to report that she was okay. Only after the lecture did she pause to ask, "What is it? What do you want?" "Only to ensure your health and safety," the man said. "Okay, you insured. Now go with peace. You could have insured my health weeks ago when I nearly died for lack of cigarettes and food. There would have been some use for you then." "No, but you wait until those dogs bomb the karaoke house next door, launching the water tank into the courtyard and blowing away my windows, setting my curtains on fire. It's a good thing I took my Valium that day because I slept through the whole thing. Look at this mess," she complained, pointing at the tank and the scattered chunks of concrete. "No amount of sweeping can clean this stuff. I've swept for a week and nothing has changed." Sharifi's brothers make their way back along with the families, 3 cars in a row in a line that backed up for miles. They stop at the coffee shop just before the final turn to the village. They heard that the general store in Derkifa was out of almost everything. Sharifi's nephew, Wissam, enters the coffee shop and finds it empty except for the owner behind the counter and a handful of men in civilian clothes gathered around a table sheltered by a grape arbor. The customers are sipping tea and talking loudly as if they had been served spirits. They had that air about them. Locals always could tell who belonged to the resistance, even if they shed their military garb to return to their farms and their mechanic shops and businesses. Wissam greets Abu Hassan, the owner. "Salaam alaikum." "Wa alaikum salam," Abu Hassan replies. "A carton of L&Ms, if you please." "Here you go. You're from Derkifa, right?" "Yes." "Aoun's son?" "No, his nephew." "I know your uncle. You look just like him when he was your age." Suddenly, the men's chatter comes to a halt, and all turn to examine Wissam. The oldest one among them, a man with a broad tanned face, receding hairline, and closely trimmed salt and pepper beard, motions to him with a flick of the wrist. "Come here. I want to ask you a question." Wissam walks up and greets the men. "You're from Derkifa?" the man asks. "Yes." "Is your house the second one on the right past the Husseiniye?" "Yes." "Do you have a grandmother, Yehai, that stayed there during the fighting?" "Yes, that's my aunt." A young man sitting in the back of the circle leans back in his chair, a cup of tea steaming in his hand, and asks, "So where were you during the war?" "We all went north to Beirut." "And you left your aunt behind?" "We asked her to come with us, but she refused. We begged and pleaded, but she has a hard head." "Really?" The young man interrupts him, scanning the men as they break out into laughter. "Yes, you have no idea." "No, we do." He looked at them, puzzled, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The older man waves at him to come closer so that he can speak directly into his ear. "Listen to me, son. The next time this happens, do your country and the resistance a favor and take your aunt with you." That's the
Yeah.
end of Sharif's story. Uh-huh.
Um, uh, Finding humor in such a dark subject is part of dealing with coping with trauma, and I think that's a fantastic illustration of it. And the character of the aunt just you know, the image at the end of her just sweeping around this massive water tank that's been blown into the center of her courtyard, and just being upset that she can't clean it away, I
Yeah.
think really gets to the heart of those kind of coping mechanisms, and the way that you have to exist when uh, everything around is madness. But it's not just military violence that kind of permeates these stories. There's also examples of political violence and religious repression, and things like that. To what extent, I think, let me ask you, to what extent are these things sort of preying on your mind when you're in the process of writing these stories? Obviously, you've said, the situation kind of comes to you first, and that the characters come first. But finding the right ways to incorporate the political climate around these stories, is that something that just kind of comes naturally out of telling the story because this is the setting it's in, or is that something that you very consciously kind of construct in order to surround the characters with?
Right. I think you said it. You said it. You were spot on when you said earlier, Glenn, that this is about characters. It's usually the characters that carry the story. It's the characters that stick with me, and I always like. In this case, it was a character. It's based on a character that I've spent a lot of time with. In the case of the other story, Is This How You Eat a Watermelon? It's a character that I had to construct his life out of his funeral, basically, and work backwards. And I just found it fascinating. And then the war just happens to come into the picture. Because of the time and how they respond to war and so on and so forth. And also like the in terms of humor, I really need to I really need to find some humor in the story to kind of deal with it. There's one story here that is basically that I've let's just say I've lived it. Send my regards to your mother, which is a prison story, which is somebody, a young man being accused of terrorism in Bahrain, in the island of Bahrain, which for those of you who are not familiar with that part of the world, it's a little island off of Saudi Arabia. And it's the kind of the opposite of Saudi Arabia. It's like everything's allowed. It's a party town. But anyway, he gets arrested and accused of terrorism by the Bahraini government. And whenever I told that story before I wrote it, people would say, well, you should write this. This is an amazing story. And I would say, I would write it, but how do I distinguish this prison story from other ones, right? So, and one day I was actually teaching a class at a workshop, and I just had this throwaway line where I told one of the students that when I was in prison, this is what happened, and they like the one of the students who was like the mother hen of the workshop. We had those. You know what I'm talking about, Glenn. But she said, "Wait a minute, what did you just say?" And he says, "You have to tell us that story." So when I told the story, as I was walking out, one of the students who's a close friend of mine now, he told me, there was something funny about that story. And I said, what part was funny? And he told me that the character, the person that was imprisoned, was the whole time he had these baby blue Ocean Pacific shorts on him that he used, and they sort of like run through the story. And he pointed some other things. But once I found the humor, I knew where to grab that story, right? And I knew that I can make it into a different story than those regular stories, which is like one misery, like a cataloging of miseries, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And, yeah,
the idea of avoiding kind of what would otherwise be kind of the obvious or the cliched side of the story of an imprisonment, and focusing more on the really human aspect of some of the absurdity of it all.
exactly. Absurdity is the right word. I found absurdity in all of those stories. The titular story is because I wanted to. I wrote it because, and it stuck with me because of a lot of the absurdity that existed there.
Yeah, and I think this idea of humor and absurdity kind of is a great example of how there's something just so human about it, because that's how we as people, as you know, how we deal with trauma, how we cope. And there's a fine line between like a coping mechanism and kind of laughing in spite of the circumstance. And I think you do such a great job of treading that line, and really showing the kind of both sides, and the humanity that exists of both, and the communities that can be kind of spring up in such coping mechanisms and in such absurdity, the connections that it brings out of people. For a good example in that story you mentioned, in my regards to your mother, is the cellmate, the one who's been there and who's actually gone through a much worse time than the narrator, um,
Exactly.
and the connection that's formed between the two of them, and the relationship that they form.
Yeah.
Um, and this idea of absurdity too, I think, and this is going to segue into another little section that I'd like you to read,
Mhm.
in this I guess third story in the collection is this Syed and the Snow Woman,
Right.
uh, and kind of an absurd situation that comes about there. So I wonder if you might read that, and we can talk a little bit about it.
Sure. Yeah. So the Sayyid and the Snow Woman is also takes place in the same village. That I had just read you part of a story that takes place in the village of Derkifa. Takes place in that same village, and the Sayyid is actually a cleric here in the story. And the elevator pitch for the story became on the book tour that a first snowfall, because in South Lebanon there is no, it doesn't snow, and there was like this miraculous snowfall that made the inhabitants of the village basically lose their inhibitions. And so yeah, this is a situation where you have this Sayyid, this cleric, waking up and realizing that it's snowing outside in this village, in this rural setting, and his wife her name is Taj, um, which in Arabic actually means a crown, and his wife Taj is watching him and realizes that what he's making, and so I'm going to read that part. At the same time, um, there are the nephews of this cleric, and his children are all these houses have a courtyard, and they have like three sections usually that enclose the courtyard, and the courtyard usually looks away from the street, so you have the open air, but you also have the privacy, right, for the families. So three families share that courtyard, and they're all related to, they're all from the same family. And so they're watching from the second floor onto the courtyard and watching this thing unfold. They stop, and this is the children. When I say they, is the children. They stop short of the stairs, and decide to set their cups of tea on the balcony wall to watch the scene. Sayyid Abdullah is busy below them, gathering the snow in the lower courtyard. The top of his head is totally exposed except for the fine hair that was now plastered to his temples from the melting snow. The curled flat licks framing his temples bring to mind Roman emperors with their coiled crowns. At first, he struggles with the shape of his creation, which keeps sloughing, but then, as the temperature drops, the snow starts to adhere and things start to take shape. The two boys love watching him in his child mode, but what really rivets them far beyond the desire to frolic in their first snow is that they realize that he's not making an inanimate object, but a human likeness, something that is long forbidden by Islam, as any attempt to imitate God's creation is considered blasphemous. This is why Arabic calligraphy is so intricate and varied, as Muslim artists put all their creative energy into that craft to refrain from painting the human figure. But they don't know that the forbidden aspects of Sayyid's work are about to go beyond that. At first, they thought that the broad base of the snowman was merely a structural feature, but then they begin to make out the curve of a waist sloping to a generous bosom. At that realization, they stop mid-chew and look at each other wide-eyed with amusement. This is ice-cold sin taking shape before them. At that point, they hear a voice from below, a familiar, mournful one. The wind is going to slap you like that. Come cover your head. May God preserve you. The boys realize that Taj has been watching the whole scene. There she is, berating her husband for not covering his head, while she herself is bareheaded, naked hair hanging for all to see. Taj would never go out in the open with her head uncovered. There would always be at least a white muslin scarf wrapped loosely around her head. But she now stands in the doorway to the kitchen, bracing the door frame on one side as if expecting an earthquake, fixated on the sight of her husband creating another woman. She has that look on her face, a mournful one that teeters between weeping and laughter, eyes with a twinkle of a smile, mouth straightened with sorrow. Everyone that knew her knew that look. Abdullah, the Sayyid, doesn't even look back. With one hand, he keeps shaping the sloughing snow on the curve of the hips, and with another, he fishes in the pocket of his thobe for his cap and places it askew on his head, which lends more mischief to his appearance. World gone wonky. The Sayyid is touching temptation, and his wife is uncovered to the world askew like Sayyid's cap. To the kids, it feels as if the snow has unfurled the inhibitions of the couple. Abdullah now gathers a fistful of snow and gently pushes it onto the breasts while holding onto the back. From where his wife stands, it must seem like he's having an intimate moment with the frozen bust. Taj suddenly charges forward in socks and flip-flops. The kids have never seen her move that fast before. She gets halfway to her husband before her feet are set sideways in a slide that brings her a few feet closer before she completely loses her foothold. Her flip-flops go flying behind her as she slides hands first towards Sayyid's feet. She skids on her stomach like a seal emerging out of water before coming to a stop at her husband's ankles. Abdullah jumps around and attempts to pick her up before she does a split and falls back, taking him down with her. Have you lost your mind? Abdullah says as he stands up, feet straddling her supine, muddied body, and tries to lift her up again, this time managing to heave her by the hands grab her around the waist, and twirl into the momentum of the lift. These two were always affectionate in their own subtle way, but never displayed the slightest bit of public affection, and here they were entangled in a tight embrace as they struggled for balance. They both start laughing as they steady themselves and walk back to the kitchen with Abdullah bracing Taj by the waist and Taj holding on to his shoulders. The couple disappears below the children's perch, and the boys turn to each other in silent bemusement. These kinds of things are not talked about. They wait for the couple to emerge from the kitchen and for Abdullah to engage in some sort of game as he usually does, but that doesn't happen. They look out on the valley and see that the snowflakes are now getting fatter. They take this shift to mean that the snowfall is going to intensify rather than diminish, because they don't know that this is because of the rise in temperature, not a drop. They watch as the snow woman's face goes askew, as if turning her head in a question. She leans sideways into her diminishing waist and juts out her hip into a final flirtatious pose before collapsing. So that's the Sayyid and the Snow Woman.
Yeah, such a lovely, intimate moment. The line in there, "These kinds of things are not talked about," really stands out to me. It speaks at once to the immediate situation, of course, the idea that in such a religiously governed society that these sorts of intimacies are very kind of taboo, but and that the boys would have not seen very much of this at all from their uncle. But in a broader sense, I think it speaks to your work as a whole and this book as a whole. The idea that these sorts of characters and these sorts of intimate scenes aren't often what we see in depictions of the Middle East from a Western point of view.
Right.
You know, and you as an author of color and as someone from that part of the world, how important do you think it is to show these simple moments of intimacy and humanity to a Western audience?
Right. Yeah, I think it's really important. It's something that kind of is always operating on me. It's always like I'm always I might not be conscious of it, but I really do believe that there's a difference, I think, between like trying to humanize people or just trying to portray the human condition in the best way that you can as a writer. I think there's a distinction that I make between those two things, because when I set my intentions to humanizing my people, it feels what comes out is more didactic and stilted. But when I just focus on the human condition, what I'm interested in, the regard of race and so on, that's when I get what I'm trying to get at. And so many people have remarked about how fresh, what a fresh look, what a fresh perspective they have on my people and on on that region from these stories, which is the best praise I can get. Yeah.
And finding connections with people, again, like I have a family member just like that, or that reminds me of a scene that my parents had when I was young and it snowed, or sometimes I feel like that when it snows and it takes me right back to my childhood. Those moments of shared humanity, I think, are really vital, and it's what gives this book its vitality, I think.
Yeah.
So
Thanks.
yeah.
I-
Go ahead.
No, I think we're up to the Q&A. If there's any Q&A, there's Stephanie.
Hi. Yes. We do have a couple of questions, and I just want to start by thanking both of you. Zein, thank you for the readings, and Glenn, thank you for the great questions. I'll go ahead and add to the chorus of people who have an answer, grandma, like the one you described. I was raised by someone much like who was a force of nature up until she passed in her early 90s. So yeah, so the first question, Zein, is about writing poetry and writing longer form fiction, and the transition between the two, the inspiration to make that shift, and how each affects the other process.
Right. So I got my MFA. I changed careers late in life. I was a civil engineer for 20 years before I joined the MFA program. That's where Glenn and I met, and for those kinds of programs, you're sort of like you have to make a choice between prose or poetry. You can't, and I found that kind of handicapping for me, because I've always felt that I'm a storyteller first and foremost, and that some stories come out in poetry, some in prose, some, and some in novels and longer works. But we were kind of pushed that, and they actually put the workshops. I don't know if I ever told Glenn this, but I was trying to take a prose workshop, but you can't. Once you choose, yeah, right, Glenn.
They schedule them at the same time, so
yes,
that to prevent it.
Yeah. So I wrote a lot of poetry, and of course in those 3 years, and I was still writing short prose, but later I would write. I finished several manuscripts of poetry, but then a lot of stories that I already had short stories that were first drafts, and I had a novel that had started, which now I'm actually working on. And since being nominated for the Pen Prize, agents contact me, and when I tell them I have a ready manuscript, a poetry manuscript to give to them, and they say, we can talk about that later, but do you have a novel? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's what's marketable.
Pick a lane, Zein.
Exactly.
We've got to pigeonhole you somehow.
So they, so all this to say is that I've never thought of myself as, purely a poet or a writer, but I did grow up in a very rich environment in terms of poetry, a lot of poems. My father, knew, by memory, dozens of, I maybe close to, I don't know, it's, as he grew older, his long-term memory actually improved. And so he remembered, things would percolate up while, in the middle, while he's driving, and he would read it. And we had a competition. We used to have competitions in the village where, before TV came into the picture, the city, I lived in these two lives where in the city, Beirut was lit up like Vegas, and the countryside didn't even have TV. But instead of that, there would be these slam poetry competitions, happening in these courtyards that we've mentioned in these stories. And it was a specific kind of competition called Zajal, where you say a stanza and then the person would have to answer starting with the last word of that stanza. So you either have to memorize tons of poems, and you also have to be able, if you can't remember a stanza that begins with that, Like you would say, oh, he ended with mule. How are you going to start with mule? You have to be able to improvise on the spot. So my upbringing was mainly this love of poetry by everybody, but at the same time, the majoring in poetry was looked down upon. So, the way my father thought about it, as many fathers did there, traditional Arab fathers that were living in, that came out of that region, is that if you fail in the sciences, you go to liberal arts. That's how you get into liberal arts. So you like, why should you go to liberal arts first? You have to go to sciences. You could always we could always, read poetry and recite poetry and all that. We don't need a college degree for that. You know what I mean? So they respected it, but they didn't want you to be a writer.
Right. There's a difference between having it as a vocation and an avocation.
Exactly.
And committing to it that way. Right.
Exactly.
And Glenn, and when you were in the MFA program, what was your pigeonhole?
Well, I kind of came at it from a different point of view than Zein. I was like 100% a poet. I didn't, coming from my undergraduate experience, I went to undergrad at the University of North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And my professor down there used to call it committing fiction, just as a joke, because there was always that rivalry between the poets and the fiction writers. But for myself, in my own writing, I always said I don't have the patience for fiction. I couldn't conceive of anything that big. For me, it was more a meditation that maybe more meditation than storytelling, as Zein was talking about, where it would just kind of be an idea or something I had to work through, and then I would write the poem and then move on to the next. So I also I didn't really come to writing until a little bit later. I didn't have any sort of experience like Zein did with it being kind of in the culture around him. My parents read a lot, but never really poetry. And it was just studying it in school that kind of got me interested, and I started writing on my own and got to college and tried the sciences. That didn't work out. But I was always taking English classes, and I found this poetry writing class, and I was like, oh, that's it. That's it from here on.
But you have ancestry that was like steeped in bluegrass in Nashville or something, right?
Old time music, yeah. And just I have old roots in the mountains, I think, and that helps. And I like to think my poetry was always very much rooted in place, just as your stories are kind of rooted in South Lebanon to a certain extent. Even the ones that don't take place there, there's always that kind of hearkening back to them. And I kind of feel the same way about the mountains.
So I have another sort of it's not really I guess it is actually, it's a process question, because you've talked, Zein, about being a storyteller and studying poetry, but that never having been sort of necessarily the thing, right? But do you approach the writing differently, or do you know going in that this idea needs to be a poem, or needs to be a short story, or needs to be something longer, or might that change sort of midstream? And then does the actual process itself, in terms of like how it gets from in your head to the page, does that adjust in terms of whatever your writing day, your writing world looks like?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the approach is completely different, right? With my poetry and with my short stories. I think that, like with the prose, I think even though I fought my father on the engineering degree, but I do approach it like an engineer sometimes, and especially now the novel. I mean, it's like I have a wall full of, stickers and arrows and, like a structure. Yeah, yeah. Pointing, I have these big stickies and I'm seeing where the overlaps and I write. Um, but I also like in the practice of poetry has helped me so much in sense. And now I'm writing a novel. I'm not writing the novel chronologically. I'm writing it in pearls according to inspiration.
Mm.
Just like I would the poem. So I'm writing them and they overlap, and there's repetition. So the whole structuring thing is I'm trying to figure out where the overlap is, which is really exhausting. But it's but I'm writing according, and then like I'm writing in pearls and then stringing them together, and the tapering is what's exhausting, and but the creation is joyous and fluid and lucid. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, well, how would that differ then from you when you write a poem? Is it the subject matter that determines, oh, this is a good character, this is something more suitable for a short story, or this is an idea or a thought that I want to work through that's more poetic? Maybe that's it. Does it come to you before, or do you just sit down and start writing, and then whatever comes out kind of determines?
No, it always comes before, and the and I wish every day was like this, but this is like would be my ideal day, which is you wake up, you read something, and it gets your juices flowing, and you remember something, and then you start writing. You move right to the page, and you start writing, and I've rarely. I've always known whether this is a poem or this is going to be a short prose. For when I was writing the short stories and the poems, I already always knew what it was. But at some point, I had to go and just focus on one. And I got a residency in the Blue Mountain Center in upstate New York, and I went there for a month where I took the drafts of these stories, and I had to write every day and focus just on that. Just like right now, I'm not writing. I'm sure it depends also what I read in the morning. What's feeding me in the morning. I haven't written poetry for a while since I've started between the book tour and writing a novel, and agents saying we want the whole novel right now, and trying to catch the momentum. You can't wait too long. These people will go away. They're very fickle. Yeah, but so I'm trying to focus as much as possible. But poetry was more like I would write a stanza and put it in a drawer, and then I would write another stanza the next day and put it in a drawer, and then at some point I just open the drawer and take a stanza that speaks to me, and then I complete that thought. Or I would be watching something, listening or reading to something, and I run to the table because I know how this thing happens. I'm a morning writer, but a lot of times late at night, I knew how to finish something. The other thing I do is my favorite sport is swimming. And so if I get stuck, I don't believe in a writer's block. I just think that sometimes you want to untangle a problem. I choose not to believe in writer's block. So with swimming, I set my intention before I go into the water. There's something about, being in that womb, in that, and you're like thinking, the physical movement helps me untangle stuff. And so I always have a notebook in my gym bag, because when I get out of the water, I know a lot of times I untangle things and I write and incomplete. But first, my process is like first drafts sit for a while in terms of poetry, and I start another one, and then I come back later and read it as a reader and revise as a reader.
Yeah, I think that distance is important. The
Yeah.
kind of distance from the immediacy of the inspiration to the final, tweaking and revising and structuring. For
Yeah.
me, it's walking, by the way. For you, it's swimming.
Walking, yeah.
Walking, hiking, getting out just clears my head, and the physical movement is very important as well.
Yeah.
I agree.
This woman that wrote If You Want to Write in the 40s, which became like a book that everybody carried that wanted to be a writer, used to have this great advice. She says, walk longer than you want to, and there will be a vacuum, and that vacuum will start filling up with ideas because you're like bored that you're walking beyond that you wanted to, and that your mind will start just pulling things out of the air, basically.
Yeah.
That's a great piece of advice. There's been several great pieces of advice this evening for folks who are writing. So thank you for that. And thank you again, Zein, for joining us, for being with us virtually. And we'll look forward to another opportunity to have you in town. And Glenn, thank you so much for joining us this evening and having such a great conversation with Zein. And it's been really great to hear from you. We're actually at 7:02, but Zein, I know that you're working on a novel and have some poetry, have a poetry manuscript as well. And then Glenn, I don't know if you'd like to tell us about anything that you're working on right now.
Nothing specific.
Okay.
Kind of bits and bobs, but nothing really to promote.
Yeah, and no pressure ever. Just so keep us posted, and then just last words from each of you before we say goodnight to our audience. And thank you so much again.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be representing the hometown. And thanks also to Zein, my dear friend, and congratulations on the book. And here's hoping that you do well with the PEN Award.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Malaprops. And I can't wait to go to Asheville in person. This was supposed to be in person, and I was so happy to find an excuse because I've been there once, and I was I fell in love with the place. And one thing that out of all things that reminded me of Asheville is this reading, actually, out of all things, La Lacuna by Barbara Kingsolver, which takes partly, one of the locations is actually Asheville, and the way she portrays it, because she knows how to do nature, basically, was really lovely and made me miss it. But yeah, I'm looking forward to being there one day in person and hanging out with you and Glenn, because I haven't seen Glenn since the MFA, since Baltimore days. He was in Baltimore, which were great days. But thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'm glad you got to at least spend some time together, electronically.
Yeah.
And it's been great to be with you. Thanks again to everyone who's joined us this evening. And we look forward to seeing you all again, in whatever way you can show up. We're always glad to have you. So good night, everybody. Stay safe and well. Thank you.
Good night.